Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide extraordinary secrets. What started as a regular tourist's innocent question to a royal guard would soon uncover a mystery that had been buried for over 30 years. The guard's world was about to be turned upside down by a stranger carrying nothing more than an old photograph and a heart full of hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his scarlet tunic for the 100th time that day. 22 years of service had made these movements automatic, like breathing or blinking. The heavy bearskin hat sat perfectly balanced on his head, and his polished boots reflected the early light. James had always taken pride in his appearance, knowing that tourists from around the world came to see the precision and grandeur of the Queen's Guard. At 45 years old, James had seen everything a royal guard could possibly see. He had stood motionless through thunderstorms, endured the blazing summer heat, and maintained his composure, while countless tourists tried everything imaginable to make him break character. Children had jumped in front of him, adults had told jokes, and some had even tried to touch his uniform. Nothing fazed him anymore, or so he thought. The morning crowd was typical for a Wednesday in late September. School groups shuffled past with their teachers trying to maintain order. Elderly couples walked slowly while pointing at the architecture, and young backpackers snapped endless photos. James had learned to tune out the constant chatter and focus on his duties. His job was simple: stand guard, maintain discipline, and ensure the safety of the royal residents. Margaret Chen had been planning this trip to London for 3 years. As a retired schoolteacher from Vancouver, Canada, she had saved every penny to make her dream of visiting England a reality. At 68 years old, she moved more slowly than she used to, but her eyes still sparkled with curiosity and wonder. She had studied British history all her life, and standing before Windsor Castle felt like stepping into a living textbook. Margaret approached the guard station where James stood at attention. She had read that the guards weren't supposed to interact with tourists, but something deep inside her chest made her want to try anyway. She pulled out a small, worn photograph from her purse and held it with trembling fingers. The image showed a young man in military uniform standing proud and tall with a gentle smile on his face. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you can't speak while on duty, but I wanted to show you this picture of my son. He always dreamed of being a royal guard like you. He used to say it was the most honorable job in the world." James continued, staring straight ahead, his training keeping him perfectly still. He had heard similar stories countless times. Parents often shared tales of their children's dreams or military service. It was touching, but he had learned to listen without reacting. However, something in Margaret's voice made him want to glance down at the photograph, though he resisted the urge. Margaret continued talking, not expecting a response, but needing to share her story. His name was David. David Chen. He joined the Canadian military when he was 18, just like you probably did. He was so proud of his uniform, just like you must be. Her voice began to crack slightly. He never got the chance to apply for the Royal Guard program. He died in Afghanistan 12 years ago. The words hit James like a physical blow, though he showed no outward reaction. He had lost friends in Afghanistan too. The mention of military service in that dangerous place always stirred something deep within him. He found himself wanting to offer comfort to this grieving mother, but his duty required him to remain silent and motionless. Margaret wiped a small tear from her cheek and looked up at James's stoic face. "I know you can't respond, and I don't expect you to. I just wanted someone who does what my son dreamed of doing to see his picture, to know that he existed and that he respected what you do." She was about to turn away when something made her hesitate. She looked more closely at James's face, studying his features. There was something familiar about his jawline, the shape of his nose, and the way his ears stuck out slightly. Her heart began to race as an impossible thought entered her mind. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice now shaking noticeably. "This might sound crazy, but how old are you? I mean, I know you can't answer, but you remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." James felt a strange sensation in his stomach. The woman's intense stare was making him uncomfortable, but he couldn't understand why. He had been looked at by millions of tourists over the years, but this felt different. There was something desperate and searching in her eyes. Margaret reached into her purse again and pulled out another photograph, this one much older and more faded. It showed a young woman holding a baby, both standing next to a man in casual clothes. She held it up where James could see it if he chose to look down. "This is me, 37 years ago," she said quietly. "I was much younger then, living in London for a year while my husband worked here. That's my baby, and that's my husband, Robert." She paused, studying James's face again. "But there's something I never told anyone about that year. Something I've carried with me every single day since then." James felt his heartbeat quicken, though he couldn't understand why. The woman's words seemed to be reaching some buried part of his memory, like hearing a song from childhood that you can't quite place but know you've heard before. "I had another baby that year," Margaret whispered, so quietly that only James could hear her. "A baby I gave up for adoption. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but I was young and scared and didn't know what else to do. The father was a young man who was studying to join the military. He was kind and gentle and had dreams of serving his country." The photograph in Margaret's hands was shaking now as she held it closer to where James could see it. "I never saw that baby again after I signed the papers. But I never stopped thinking about him. I never stopped wondering if he was okay, if he was happy, if he found his way to the kind of life his father would have wanted for him." James's training was being tested in a way it never had been before. His mind was racing even as his body remained perfectly still. The dates the woman mentioned, the location, the details about adoption, they aligned with things he had always known about his own past, but had never really questioned. Margaret took a deep breath and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The baby was born on March 15th. He weighed 7 pounds, 3 ounces. I held him for exactly 10 minutes before they took him away. The last thing I saw was his little fingers wrapping around mine. She looked directly into James's eyes, searching for any sign of recognition. I named him James. James Mitchell. Even though I knew his new family would probably change it, I wanted him to have a name that meant something. The world seemed to stop spinning around James. March 15th was his birthday. His adoption records had always listed his birth name as James Mitchell, though he had been told it was just a coincidence that his adoptive family had kept the same first name. 7 pounds 3 ounces was exactly the weight listed on his birth certificate. For the first time in 22 years of guard duty, James Mitchell felt his composure begin to crack. His breathing became slightly irregular, and a single drop of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The impossible was becoming possible, and he didn't know how to process what was happening. Margaret saw the subtle changes in James's posture and knew she had found what she had been searching for without even knowing she was looking. "James," she whispered, and the name sounded different coming from her lips than it had from anyone else's in his entire life. "Is it really you?" James stood frozen, his duty battling against the overwhelming need to respond to this woman who might hold the answers to questions he had carried his whole life. Around them, tourists continued their visits completely unaware that they were witnessing a moment that had been 37 years in the making. Margaret reached out slowly and placed her hand gently on the barrier that separated her from James. "I know you can't speak while you're working, but if you are my son, please find a way to let me know. I've been looking for you my whole life, even when I didn't know I was looking." James felt tears forming in his eyes for the first time since he was a child. The weight of his bearskin hat seemed unbearable, and the scarlet tunic felt like it was suffocating him. Every fiber of his being wanted to break protocol, to speak to this woman, to find out if the impossible connection they both felt was real. But his training held firm. Years of discipline and dedication to duty kept him standing at attention even as his world crumbled and rebuilt itself around him. He was a royal guard first, and that meant something. It meant honor and sacrifice and putting duty above personal needs, no matter how desperate those needs might be. Margaret understood. She had been married to a military man long enough to recognize the struggle between duty and desire. "I'll wait," she said simply. "I've waited 37 years. I can wait a little longer." She stepped back from the barrier but didn't leave. Instead, she found a bench nearby where she could sit and watch, holding both photographs in her hands like precious treasures. The rest of James's shift passed in a blur of emotions and questions. He performed his duties automatically, his body going through the motions while his mind raced with possibilities and fears. What if she was wrong? What if she was right? What if this was just a coincidence? What if it wasn't? He thought about his adoptive parents, who had loved him and raised him well. They had always been honest about his adoption and had encouraged him to search for his birth parents if he ever wanted to. But he had never felt the need. He had been happy and secure, and the idea of disrupting that had never appealed to him. Now, standing guard while a woman who might be his mother waited patiently on a nearby bench, James realized that happiness and security weren't the same thing as completeness. There had always been a small empty space inside him, a space he had learned to ignore, but that had never really gone away. As the clock tower chimed noon, signaling the end of his shift, James knew that his life was about to change forever. The changing of the guard ceremony began with its usual precision and pageantry, but for the first time in his career, James was counting the minutes until he could step out of formation. Margaret watched the ceremony with tears streaming down her face, no longer caring who saw them. If this young man was her son, she was seeing him at work, seeing the pride and honor she had always hoped he would find in his life. If he wasn't her son, she was still witnessing something beautiful and meaningful, something that reminded her of all the dreams she had held for the baby she gave away so long ago. When the ceremony concluded and the new guard took their positions, James walked toward the changing room with measured steps, his mind already planning what he would say to the woman who was waiting for him. For the first time in 22 years, Sergeant James Mitchell was going to break the ultimate rule of being a Royal Guard. He was going to let his personal life matter more than his duty. The old photograph in Margaret's hands showed a young woman full of hope and fear, holding a baby she would love forever but couldn't keep. The new reality forming around them both was about to reveal whether love could bridge a gap of 37 years and whether some connections are too strong to be broken by time, distance, or duty. James's hands shook as he unbuttoned his scarlet tunic in the guard's changing room. The familiar routine of removing his ceremonial uniform felt strange and disconnected, as if he was watching someone else go through the motions. His fellow guards chatted about their evening plans and weekend leave, their voices sounding distant and muffled. He had shared this space with these men for years, but suddenly felt like he was existing in a completely different world. "You all right, Mitchell?" asked Corporal Thompson, noticing James's unusual quietness. "You look like you've seen a ghost." James forced a smile and nodded. "Just tired, I suppose. Long morning." The lie felt heavy on his tongue, but he wasn't ready to explain what had happened. He wasn't sure he could explain it even if he wanted to. As he changed into his civilian clothes, James caught sight of himself in the mirror. He studied his reflection with new eyes, looking for traces of the woman who might be his mother. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his mouth, the way his hair grew at his temples. Could these features belong to Margaret Chen? Had she seen her own face reflected in his? 20 minutes later, James walked back toward the castle courtyard where Margaret was still waiting. She sat on the bench exactly where he had last seen her, but now she looked smaller and more fragile. Without the barrier of his official duty between them, she was holding both photographs in her lap, staring down at them with an expression that mixed hope with terror. When she looked up and saw him approaching in civilian clothes, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Without the formal uniform and bearskin hat, she could see his face clearly for the first time. The resemblance to Robert, her husband from all those years ago, was unmistakable. But more than that, she could see something of herself in the way he carried himself, the way he moved with careful consideration for others around him. James sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of 37 years pressed down on them both, making even simple words feel impossible. "I'm James," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "James Mitchell." "I know," Margaret replied, tears already forming in her eyes. "I gave you that name." They sat in silence again, both trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. Around them, tourists continued their visits, taking photos and chatting about the changing of the guard ceremony they had just witnessed. Life continued normally for everyone else. while their world shifted on its axis. "Tell me about the adoption," James said quietly. "Tell me what happened." Margaret took a shaky breath and began to share a story she had never told anyone completely. "Your father and I met at a coffee shop near Hyde Park. I was 22, visiting London while Robert was working at the embassy. Robert is my husband now, but back then we were just dating long distance. We had agreed to see other people while I was here for the year." James listened carefully, trying to imagine his mother as a young woman in a foreign city, trying to piece together the circumstances that led to his existence. "Your father was a student at the Royal Military Academy. His name was Michael Harrison. He was 24, kind, intelligent, and completely committed to his dream of serving his country. We fell in love quickly, the way young people do when everything feels urgent and important." Margaret smiled sadly at the memory. "He talked about honor and duty constantly. He would have made an excellent officer." "What happened to him?" James asked. Margaret's smile faded. "He died in a training accident 2 months before you were born. A helicopter crash during a night exercise. I was devastated and completely alone. Robert had returned to Canada, and I was too proud to call him and tell him I was pregnant with another man's baby." James felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the father he would never know, and relief that the man hadn't simply abandoned his mother. "So you decided on adoption?" "I was young, broke, and scared. I couldn't imagine raising a baby alone in a foreign country with no support system. The adoption agency promised me that you would go to a good family. People who desperately wanted a child and could give you everything I couldn't." Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I told myself I was doing what was best for you, but every day since then I've wondered if I made the right choice." "You did," James said firmly. "My parents were wonderful. They gave me love, stability, education, and support for everything I wanted to do. They encouraged me to join the military, just like my birth father wanted to. They taught me about honor and duty and service." He paused, looking at Margaret intently. "They also taught me about sacrifice, and I understand why you made the choice you did." Margaret broke down completely then, 37 years of guilt and wondering, pouring out of her in tears she couldn't control. James hesitated for only a moment before putting his arm around her shoulders, offering the comfort she had been denied for so long. "I tried to find you," she sobbed. "When you turned 18, I contacted the adoption agency, but the records were sealed. I hired a private investigator, but the laws were different then, and there wasn't much he could do. I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped wondering if you were okay." "I'm more than okay," James said gently. "I have a good life, a career I'm proud of, and parents who love me. And now I have answers to questions I didn't even know I was carrying." As Margaret's tears subsided, James found himself studying her face more carefully. Now that he knew who she was, the resemblance was obvious. They had the same nose, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting their head when they were thinking. He wondered how many other traits they shared, what other connections existed between them that went beyond genetics. "Tell me about David," James said, remembering the photograph that had started this entire encounter. "Tell me about your son who died in Afghanistan." Margaret's face brightened despite her tears. "David was my second chance at being a mother. Robert and I got married 2 years after I returned to Canada, and David was born when I was 25. He was curious, brave, and determined to help people. He joined the military because he wanted to make a difference in the world." She pulled out the first photograph again, the one of David in his uniform. "He looked like you when he was young. Same height, same build, same serious expression when he was concentrating on something important. When I saw you standing there this morning, for just a moment I thought maybe it was David somehow. Maybe he had survived and found his way to the place he always dreamed of being." James understood. He had seen the desperate hope in her eyes when she first approached him, the way she had looked at him like he might be the answer to a prayer she had been afraid to pray. "He would have made a good royal guard," James said, looking at David's photograph. "I can see the dedication in his eyes. He admired guards like you so much. When he was little, he used to stand at attention in the living room for as long as he could, pretending to be protecting important people. He said it was the most honorable job in the world, because it required putting others before yourself every single day. They talked for hours as the afternoon faded into evening. Margaret shared stories about David's childhood, his dreams, his last letters from Afghanistan before the roadside bomb that ended his life. James told her about his own military training, his journey to becoming a Royal Guard, his adoptive parents who had supported him every step of the way. As the sun began to set, they realized they both had so much more to say, but that one afternoon couldn't possibly contain 37 years of missed conversations. "What happens now?" Margaret asked as they prepared to part ways. "I don't know," James admitted. "This morning I was just a guard doing his job. Tonight, I'm a son who found his mother and a brother to someone I'll never get to meet. I need time to process all of this." Margaret nodded understandingly. "I've waited this long. I can wait longer if you need time to figure things out." "No," James said quickly. "I don't need time to decide if I want you in my life. I just need time to figure out how to fit a mother into a life that never had space for one before." Before Margaret left, she wrote down her contact information and gave James copies of the photographs she had been carrying. "These belong to you now," she said. "Pictures of your birth father, pictures of David, pictures of the mother you never knew you had." James looked down at the photographs in his hands. They felt impossibly heavy and incredibly precious at the same time. In a few hours, he had gone from being an orphan who happened to know he was adopted to being a son with a history, a story, and a family he was only beginning to understand. "There's something else," Margaret said hesitantly as they stood to leave. "Something I haven't told you yet." James felt his stomach tighten. After everything they had shared, what could be left to reveal? "I remarried after Robert died 10 years ago. My current husband, Frank, doesn't know about you. I never told him about the baby I gave up for adoption. I was afraid he would think less of me, or that it would complicate our relationship." James considered this new information. His mother had kept him a secret for decades, even from the man she married. He wondered how that felt for her, carrying the weight of his existence alone all these years. "Will you tell him now?" James asked. "I think I have to. Meeting you changes everything. I can't go back to pretending you don't exist now that I know you're alive and well and standing in front of me." Margaret looked determined despite her obvious anxiety. "He's a good man. He'll understand, especially when he meets you." As they walked toward the castle gates together, James realized that finding his mother meant disrupting not just his own life, but hers as well. She would have to navigate telling her husband, possibly telling other family members, explaining to friends why she had never mentioned a son she gave up for adoption decades ago. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. "Are you sure you want to open up your life to include me? It's going to be complicated." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "James, I've been incomplete for 37 years. There has been a hole in my heart shaped exactly like you, and no amount of time or distance or new relationships has been able to fill it. Meeting you today is the answer to every prayer I was afraid to say out loud. Complications don't scare me anymore. Living without you in my life is what scares me." As they reached the street where Margaret's taxi was waiting, James felt the reality of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. Tomorrow he would have to return to his duties as a royal guard, standing at attention for hours while tourists took pictures and children tried to make him laugh. But everything would be different now because he would know that somewhere in the world, a woman named Margaret Chen was thinking about him with love and pride, instead of wonder and worry. "Will you call me?" Margaret asked as she got into the taxi. "Tomorrow," James promised. "After my shift ends tomorrow, I'll call you, and we'll figure out what happens next." As the taxi pulled away, James stood on the sidewalk outside Windsor Castle. Still holding the photographs Margaret had given him, the weight of his new reality was overwhelming. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly complete. He had found his mother, learned about his father, and discovered he had a brother who had died serving his country with the same dedication James brought to his own service. Walking back toward his flat, James wondered what his adoptive parents would think about this development. They had always encouraged him to search for his biological family if he ever wanted to, but they had also made it clear that they would always be his real parents regardless of genetics or timing. The photographs in his pocket seemed to pulse with importance as he walked through the quiet London streets. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of building a relationship with a woman who was both a stranger and the most important person he had never met. Tonight, he would call his adoptive parents and share the news that would change all their lives forever. The royal guard who had started the day believing he was alone in the world was ending it as a son, a brother to a hero, and a keeper of stories he was only beginning to understand. Sometimes the most extraordinary things happen during the most ordinary moments, and sometimes the people we need most find us when we least expect them. The phone call to his adoptive parents was the hardest conversation James had ever had. He sat in his small flat staring at the photographs Margaret had given him, trying to find the right words to explain what had happened. How do you tell the people who raised you with unconditional love that you found your birth mother, and that it changes everything while changing nothing at all? "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something important," James began when his adoptive mother, Carol Mitchell, answered the phone. Within minutes, his adoptive father, David Mitchell, had joined the call on speakerphone. As James recounted the events at the castle, he could hear his mother crying softly in the background. But these weren't tears of sadness or betrayal. They were tears of joy mixed with relief that their son had finally found the missing piece of his identity puzzle. "We've been waiting for this day for 22 years, Carol said through her tears. "We always knew that someday you might find your birth family, and we've been hoping they were good people who would add to your life, not take away from it." David Mitchell, a retired military officer himself, understood the significance of James's discovery in a way that touched his son deeply. A royal guard finding his mother and learning his birth father was military too. There's honor in that lineage, son, and there's honor in how you handled yourself today. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" James asked, still worried about hurting the people who had given him everything. "James," his adoptive father said firmly, "finding your birth mother doesn't make you any less our son. It just means you have more people to love, and more people who love you. That's never a bad thing." The conversation lasted 2 hours, with James sharing every detail he could remember about Margaret, about David's military service, about the circumstances that led to his adoption. His adoptive parents asked thoughtful questions and offered gentle guidance, just as they had throughout his entire life. "When do we get to meet her?" Carol asked near the end of the call. The question surprised James. He hadn't considered that his two families would want to meet each other, but it made perfect sense. Margaret was part of his story now, which meant she was part of their story too. "I'll ask her when I call tomorrow," James promised. "I think she'd like that very much." The next morning, James's shift at the castle felt surreal. He stood in the same position where he had first heard Margaret's voice. But everything was different now. Tourists still approached with cameras and questions. Children still tried to make him laugh, and elderly couples still pointed at his uniform with admiration. But now James understood that any one of these people might be carrying their own stories of loss, hope, and searching. A young mother approached with her toddler son, trying to explain what a royal guard does. "He protects important people," she told the boy, "and he has to be very brave and very strong." James found himself thinking about Margaret, about how she had protected him in the only way she knew how, by placing him with a family who could give him the life she couldn't provide. That took a different kind of courage, but it was courage nonetheless. When his shift ended, James called Margaret from his flat. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone all day. "James," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I was hoping you would call. I told my adoptive parents about meeting you," James said. "They want to meet you, if you're comfortable with that." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that James wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "They want to meet me? They're not angry or threatened?" "They're grateful," James said simply. "They raised me to understand that love multiplies. It doesn't divide. Finding you doesn't take anything away from them. It just adds to the family." They spent the next hour planning a meeting for the following weekend. Margaret would return to London, and James would bring his adoptive parents to meet the woman who had given him life. It would be awkward and emotional and probably a little overwhelming for everyone involved, but it felt necessary and right. "There's something I need to tell you before we meet again," Margaret said as their conversation was winding down. "I talked to Frank last night. I told him about you." James held his breath, waiting to hear how her husband had reacted to learning about a secret son after 10 years of marriage. "How did he take it?" James asked. "Better than I expected, actually. He's hurt that I didn't trust him enough to tell him sooner, but he understands why I kept it secret. He wants to meet you too, if you're open to that." James found himself smiling. In the span of 2 days, he had gone from having 2 parents to having 2 parents, a birth mother and a stepfather he had never known existed. His family was expanding in ways he couldn't have imagined. "Of course I want to meet him," James said. "If he's important to you, then he's important to me." Over the following week, James threw himself into research about his birth father, Michael Harrison. Military records from the 1980s weren't easy to find, but with the help of some contacts in the Ministry of Defense, Michael Harrison had been an exemplary cadet at the Royal Military Academy. His instructors described him as dedicated, intelligent, and naturally gifted at leadership. He had been studying logistics and planning with hopes of specializing in peacekeeping operations. His death in the helicopter training accident had been ruled completely accidental, the result of mechanical failure during a night navigation exercise. James found himself staring at a photograph of his birth father for hours, looking for resemblances and trying to imagine what kind of man he would have grown up to be. Michael had James's build and coloring, but there was something in his eyes that reminded James of his own reflection, a seriousness tempered with kindness, a sense of duty balanced with compassion. Reading about Michael's goals and aspirations, James realized that his own career path had been remarkably similar to what his birth father had planned. They had both chosen military service as a way to serve something larger than themselves. They had both been drawn to roles that required discipline, honor, and sacrifice. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore. The weekend meeting was arranged for Sunday afternoon at a quiet restaurant near Hyde Park, the same area where Margaret and Michael had met all those years ago. James arrived early with his adoptive parents, all of them nervous but excited about the unprecedented family gathering they were about to have. Margaret arrived precisely on time, accompanied by Frank, a gentleman in his 70s with kind eyes and a warm smile. The introductions were awkward at first, with everyone uncertain about the proper etiquette for meeting your son's birth mother, or your wife's secret child, or your husband's surprise stepson. But the awkwardness faded quickly as they began to share stories. Carol and David Mitchell talked about James's childhood, his school achievements, his decision to join the military, and their pride in watching him become a Royal Guard. Margaret shared stories about David, about her years of wondering and hoping, about the journey that had led her to Windsor Castle at exactly the right moment. Frank surprised everyone by producing a small wrapped gift for James. Inside was a military compass that had belonged to his late father, a World War II veteran. "Every soldier needs a compass," Frank said simply. "My father always said it wasn't just for finding your way geographically, but for finding your way morally, too. I think you're the kind of man who would appreciate that." James was moved by the gesture from this man who had learned of his existence only a week ago but was already treating him like family. He realized that Margaret's husband possessed the same generous spirit that had allowed his adoptive parents to welcome his birth mother with open arms. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation turned to David Chin, the brother James would never meet, but whose memory connected them all. Margaret showed them more photographs of David, shared letters he had written from Afghanistan, and described his dreams of someday meeting James if he ever found his way to his birth family. "He always said he felt like something was missing from our family," Margaret explained. "He used to joke that he needed an older brother to look up to. I never told him about you, but somehow he sensed that there was more to our story than I was sharing." James felt a profound sense of loss for the relationship he would never have with David, but also a strange sense of connection to someone who had shared his love of military service and his understanding of honor and duty. "I wish I could have known him," James said. "I wish I could have been the older brother he was looking for." "You can still be," Margaret said quietly. "David's memory deserves to be honored by someone who understands what he died for. You could be the brother he never had by living the kind of life he would have respected." As the gathering was ending, the 5 adults realized they had become an unconventional but genuine family. James had gained a mother, a stepfather, and the memory of a brother. Margaret had found her long-lost son and watched her current husband embrace the complicated history that came with loving her. Carol and David Mitchell had welcomed new family members who honored rather than threatened the relationships they had built with their son. They made plans to meet regularly, to share holidays and milestones, to build the kind of relationships that transcend biology and legal documents. James would visit Margaret and Frank in Canada when he could get leave. Margaret would return to London periodically to watch James perform his duties at the castle and to spend time with all her new family members. But the most significant moment came as they were saying goodbye. Margaret approached Carol Mitchell with tears in her eyes and took her hands. "Thank you," Margaret said simply. "Thank you for loving him and raising him and helping him become the kind of man I always hoped he would be. Thank you for being the mother I couldn't be." Carol smiled through her own tears. "Thank you for making the hardest decision a mother can make, and for making it out of love rather than selfishness. Thank you for trusting strangers to love your baby as much as you did." The embrace between the two women who had loved James in different ways at different times was witnessed by everyone present, but it felt like a private moment of understanding that only mothers could share. As James walked back to his flat that evening, he carried with him the business cards and phone numbers of family members he hadn't known existed a week ago. His world had expanded dramatically, but it felt more solid and secure than ever before. He had always known he was loved, but now he understood that he was loved by more people and in more ways than he had ever imagined. The photographs Margaret had given him were now displayed on his mantelpiece alongside pictures of his adoptive family. His birth father's military portrait sat next to a picture of him receiving his Royal Guard insignia. David's smiling face in his Canadian uniform was positioned next to a group photo from James's own military training. Past and present, loss and discovery, duty and love, all coexisted in the space James called home. That night, as James prepared his uniform for the next day's shift, he thought about the tourists who would approach him with their own stories and questions. He wondered how many of them carried their own secrets, their own searches, their own hopes for connections that seemed impossible, but might be just one conversation away. The Royal Guard, who had spent 22 years protecting others while standing alone, had discovered that he had never been alone at all. He had been protected and loved and hoped for by people he had never met, people who had shaped his life through their presence and their absence equally. Sometimes finding yourself means discovering that you were never lost to begin with, just waiting for the right moment to be found. 6 months after that life-changing encounter at Windsor Castle, James Mitchell stood before his commanding officer in a conversation that would reshape his understanding of duty, family, and service. Colonel Harrison had summoned him to discuss an unusual request that had come through official channels, a request that connected his professional life with his newfound personal relationships in ways he could never have anticipated. "Mitchell," Colonel Harrison began, shuffling through papers on his desk, "I've received a rather extraordinary communication from the Canadian High Commission. It seems they want to arrange a memorial service for Canadian soldiers who died in Afghanistan, and they've specifically requested you to participate in the honor guard." James felt his heartbeat quicken. He had been thinking more and more about David Chen since meeting Margaret, wondering about the brother he would never know, and the service that had cost David his life. The interesting part, the colonel continued, is that this request came with a personal note from a Mrs. Margaret Chen, who identified herself as your mother. She's worked with Canadian military officials and the High Commission to arrange this service, and she's asked specifically that you be part of the ceremony honoring her late son, David. The room felt smaller suddenly, and James had to concentrate on breathing normally. Margaret had been working behind the scenes for months to create this moment, this opportunity for James to honor the brother he had never met in the most meaningful way possible. "Sir, I should mention that Mrs. Chen is indeed my birth mother. I met her 6 months ago under rather unusual circumstances, and I've since learned about her son David, who served with Canadian forces in Afghanistan." Colonel Harrison looked up from his papers with interest. "I'm aware of the basic situation, Mitchell. Mrs. Chen was quite thorough in her correspondence. She explained the family connection and requested that you be allowed to represent both British and Canadian military traditions in this ceremony. It's unprecedented, but the request has merit." James sat quietly, overwhelmed by Margaret's thoughtfulness and the magnitude of what she was trying to arrange. She wanted him to stand for David, to represent the brother David had never known he had, to bridge the gap between their two countries and their shared commitment to military service.
"Will you accept the assignment?" the colonel asked.
"Yes, sir. It would be an honor." The memorial service was scheduled for the following month, to be held at Westminster Abbey with full military honors. James spent weeks preparing, studying Canadian military traditions and learning about the specific operations where David and his fellow soldiers had lost their lives. He read after-action reports, studied maps of Afghanistan, and tried to understand the context of David's sacrifice. Margaret flew to London 2 weeks before the ceremony, accompanied by Frank and by David's former commanding officer, Colonel Peterson, who had served with David in Afghanistan. The four of them met at James's flat for what turned out to be the most emotionally intense evening of his life. Colonel Peterson brought with him David's personal effects from his final deployment, items that had been returned to Margaret but that she had never been able to look through. Together, they opened the small box that contained letters, photographs, a journal, and various personal items that painted a picture of David's final months. "He was one of the best soldiers I ever served with," Colonel Peterson explained as they examined David's journal. "Professional, compassionate, and completely committed to helping the Afghan people build a better future for their children. He volunteered for every dangerous mission because he believed the work they were doing mattered." James read entries from David's journal with fascination and growing respect. David had written extensively about his fellow soldiers, about the Afghan families they worked with, about his hopes for peace and his fears about the cost of war. But what struck James most were the entries where David wrote about family and belonging. "I feel like there's something missing from my life," David had written 3 months before his death. "Mom and Dad gave me everything I could want, but I've always felt like our family wasn't complete. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to military service, to being part of something larger than myself. Maybe I'm looking for the brotherhood I never had at home." Margaret was crying as James read the entry aloud. "He was looking for you," she said quietly. "Even though he didn't know you existed, he was looking for the connection you two should have had." As they continued through David's belongings, they found something that took everyone's breath away. Hidden in the back of David's journal was a small photograph of a baby, with a note written in Margaret's handwriting from 37 years ago. The photograph was of James as an infant, and the note was one Margaret had written but never sent to the adoption agency. "How did he get this?" Margaret whispered, staring at the photograph. Frank looked uncomfortable as he cleared his throat. "I gave it to him, about 6 months before he deployed. I found it in your jewelry box when I was looking for your anniversary gift. I asked you about it, but you said it was nothing important, just an old picture. David saw me with it and asked questions. I told him it was probably a child you had babysat or a cousin or something, but he kept asking about it. Finally, he asked if he could have it." Margaret looked stunned. "You never told me he had taken it. He made me promise not to say anything. He said he didn't want to upset you by asking about something you obviously didn't want to talk about. But he carried that picture with him everywhere. He used to stare at it when he was thinking about home." James held the photograph of himself as a baby, realizing that David had been carrying his picture into combat zones, that his brother had been looking at his face during the final months of his life without knowing who he was looking at. "He knew," James said quietly. "Somehow, he knew." Colonel Peterson nodded. "David talked about that picture all the time. He said it reminded him that there were people worth protecting, children who deserved to grow up in a world where they could pursue their dreams safely. He said looking at that baby's face helped him remember why they were fighting." The revelation added layers of meaning to the upcoming memorial service that none of them had anticipated. David hadn't just been serving his country and protecting Afghan families. In some inexplicable way, he had been carrying his unknown brother into battle with him, drawing strength and purpose from James's image. The memorial service at Westminster Abbey brought together Canadian and British military officials, families of fallen soldiers, and dignitaries from both countries. James stood in the honor guard wearing his dress uniform, representing both his own service as a royal guard and his connection to the Canadian soldiers being honored. As the ceremony began, James saw Margaret sitting in the front row with Frank, both of them wearing the medals David had earned posthumously. His adoptive parents sat nearby, having insisted on attending to support their son and honor the brother he had never met. The sight of his entire blended family gathered together in one of Britain's most sacred spaces was almost overwhelming. When David's name was read as part of the roll call of the fallen, James felt a physical reaction he hadn't expected. His chest tightened, his eyes filled with tears, and he had to concentrate intensely on his military bearing to maintain his composure. This wasn't just a ceremony anymore. It was a funeral for the brother he would never meet, a memorial for the relationship they would never have, and a celebration of the values they had shared without knowing it. After the formal ceremony, there was a reception where families could meet with military officials and share memories of their loved ones. James was introduced to other families who had lost sons and daughters in Afghanistan, and he found himself representing not just David, but all the siblings and family connections that had been severed by war. "Your brother would be proud of you," said Mrs. Quay, Williams, whose son had served in David's unit. David talked about family all the time. He said he wanted to have a brother who understood military service, someone he could share stories with about duty and honor. He would have loved knowing you exist. As the reception was ending, Margaret approached James with a small wrapped package. "This belonged to David," she said. "Colonel Peterson thought you should have it." Inside was David's military compass, the same one he had carried through 3 deployments. Engraved on the back were the words "Find your way home" and the coordinates of their family home in Vancouver. "He always said that a soldier's most important mission is finding his way back to the people who love him," Margaret explained. "I want you to have this because you're the family he was trying to find his way back to, even though he didn't know it." James held the compass, feeling its weight and significance. It was more than a navigational tool. It was a connection to a brother who had carried his picture into battle, who had dreamed of family connections he couldn't understand, who had died serving values that James lived by every day. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling out an official-looking document. "I've been working with Canadian Veterans Affairs and the British military. Because of your connection to David and your own military service, you've been granted honorary status in the Canadian Armed Forces. It's mostly ceremonial, but it means you can officially represent Canadian military interests at joint ceremonies, and you'll be recognized as David's brother in all military records." James stared at the document, which formalized what his heart had known since reading David's journal. He was officially David Chen's brother now, recognized by both governments as family to a fallen hero. The paperwork made real the connection that had existed in spirit since Margaret first showed him David's photograph. Over the following months, James found his role as a Royal Guard expanding, to include representing Canadian interests at joint ceremonies and military events. He spoke at schools about military service, often sharing David's story alongside his own. He participated in remembrance ceremonies for Canadian forces, standing as the brother David had always wished for. But perhaps most importantly, James discovered that serving as David's representative had given his own military service deeper meaning. He wasn't just protecting buildings and dignitaries anymore. He was honoring the memory of a brother who had died, protecting ideals they both believed in. A year after meeting Margaret, James received orders that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. He was being temporarily assigned to Canadian forces for a joint training exercise, the first Royal Guard ever to serve in such a capacity. The assignment would take him to Vancouver, where he would be based near Margaret and Frank's home. "It's like David planned this somehow," Margaret said when James called to tell her about the assignment. "He's bringing you home to us, just like he always wanted to come home to family." As James prepared for his temporary assignment in Canada, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that September morning when a grieving mother had approached him with an old photograph. He had gained a family, found his history, and discovered a purpose that transcended his individual service. The Royal Guard, who had once stood alone protecting others, had learned that he was part of an unbroken chain of service and sacrifice that stretched across generations and continents. His birth father's dreams of military service lived on through James's career. David's sacrifice for peace and freedom continued through James's commitment to honor and duty. Margaret's love had bridged 37 years and 2 countries to create a family that honored both loss and hope. Standing at his post at Windsor Castle for what might be his last shift before the Canadian assignment, James thought about all the tourists who would approach him in the coming days. He wondered if any of them carried their own secrets, their own searches, their own hope for connections that seemed impossible. The photographs on his mantelpiece now included images from the memorial service, pictures of him wearing both British and Canadian insignia, and a framed copy of David's journal entry about looking for brotherhood. His birth father's portrait sat next to David's military photo, both men united in death by their shared commitment to service and their genetic connection to the Royal Guard who carried on their legacy. James understood now that duty and family weren't separate obligations competing for his attention. They were interconnected responsibilities that strengthened each other. Serving his country honored his birth father's dreams, his adoptive parents' values, and his brother's sacrifice. Finding his family had made him a better soldier, and his military service had made him a worthy brother to a hero he would never meet but would never stop honoring. The compass David had carried through Afghanistan now guided James through decisions both professional and personal. Its needle pointed not just toward magnetic north, but toward home, family, love, and service. Sometimes finding your direction means discovering that you were already heading toward exactly where you needed to be, guided by people you had never met, but who had been watching over you all along.